Hello everybody, I hope you can all hear me. I have Slack turned on and I'm keeping an eye on the web development chat room. If you have any issues or if the audio fails at any stage, perhaps you'll let me know, but I'm assuming it's working okay now. Welcome to the first web development session. Great to see you all. We've got about a dozen people online, which is great. Most of the class, as you know, will be watching it later in the afternoon or hopefully this week. So our first session, what are we going to do? Well, got some interesting things planned today. We have introducing HTML, and we'll be spending some time getting you ready really for your first lab. We've had a preliminary lab last week, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. And we've got a fair amount of material to cover on the background to what the web is, what the role of our tools are, and then what the specific elements in HTML we'll be asking you to deploy in the lab today or when you get around to it. Thanks for taking the quiz. Just wanted to have a quick look at some of the answers there for a few minutes. It was an anonymous quiz, kind of pertained to what we were doing in the starter lab last week, and just checking a little bit about your comfort level with files and folders. And everybody seems more or less on board, I think, with the first question. A folder can contain files. A folder can contain folders. But a file can't really contain files, and a file can't contain folders. I think everybody was more or less okay with that. You'll notice in that quiz there are two right answers here, so it's not entirely unique. So if you just answered one, well, I didn't really explain that in advance. Getting used to files and folders is a bit of a challenge really when you get going with the kind of tools we're using initially. As I mentioned last week, files and folders, particularly the nested folder structure and the whole nature of the directory system on modern operating systems has receded a bit from people's attention, and we've got to rediscover that really and just get used to manipulating these things. Last week we installed Sublime. It's a programmer's editor. It's not really a word processor, although it has some of the characteristics of a word processor. And you can get various plugins and like to Sublime to make it perform something like that role, but that's not really of interest to us. Complete file name, everybody was more or less on board there with option B, index.html. The other two, C and D, are more like paths, and the notion of paths and file names is well, that's something we'll be getting to grips with a bit more next week, I think, than this week. That is, the files we are dealing with are often inside folders, sometimes several levels deep, and being able to reach into them is important for linking pages together. And we're just getting a very early view of that today. Finally, which of the following is HTML tag? Most people are H1. If you tagged hello, you're not quite, not fully incorrect really. Hello, I guess, is an example of a tag, but it's not an HTML tag. It's not a named known tag in the standard, so we'd be pedantic about it and say that only C was correct in that instance. Okay, the purpose of these little quizzes isn't, you'll notice it was anonymous. That's not to test anything really, it's just to give us a point of discussion, and we'll do another one later on in today's class. So I'm assuming audio is all good. Can't see anybody saying anything on Slack, so we'll kick off then with our first exploration. I'd like to talk a little bit about the module overview again, just for a few minutes. We went through this last week for about 10 minutes in our induction session. Perhaps all a bit of a blur on that day, so let's take a quick review of it again this afternoon. Once we've got it out of the way, our main topic is going to be introducing HTML. This is preparing you for the first lab today, and that first lab is exploring the structure of HTML in a series of exercises, building a simple web page, in fact. Before we get to that, we'll do a general talk on the nature of the web. Just what does this technology mean? Where did it come from? What have been the big trends in recent years? And some technical terms we get out of the way. And then we'll go into HTML itself in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about our course then for a moment. As you know, we're coming to you once a week. Colm is doing 2 days a week, Monday and Wednesday. I'm just doing Thursday. It's a 5-credit module. And each week we're building on the previous week. So it isn't really possible to jump in any week and go forward and back. It's heavily scaffolded as we proceed, and it'll be the same with Colm, really. First 2 weeks are getting us the basics of HTML, and we're going straight beyond HTML to CSS next week. We'll be discussing what that means. Today's lab, you'll be seeing a preview of CSS, but I offer no explanation of it in advance, so it's just thrown in there as a final step in the lab to see if it makes any sense. Weeks 3 and 4 are again focusing on HTML and CSS very closely, in particular looking at a thing called the box model, which is an important aspect of laying out HTML pages. And in week 4, we're going deeper into how we might build a navigable structure on a page using some simple techniques there. Week 5 is when we will have enough done to have you have a go at your first assignment, and we'll be doing HTML templating and deployment at that stage. Week 6 is also covering the basics of HTML, but it's covering techniques we're asking you not to include in your project. It's a further interesting techniques that we'll be using later in the course. The shift from week 6 to week 7 is fairly significant. We'll be moving into the realm of applications, and also once we get into the realm of applications, we have very specific technical topics around how to build a web app. The difference between a web app and a website is something we'll be exploring in more detail then. Web app is a program. We'll be using Java, as well as the HTML and CSS we'll have learned to date. And we have a variety of topics to explore as we get deeper into web apps, including forms, sessions, and then what it means to deploy a web app itself. We have 2 assignments. The first one is to build a website, and you won't really be able to, say, get full marks in this until we've gone to topic 5. You will, though, be able to start it in about 2 weeks. So we'll give you details of that in 2 weeks, in fact. And you can spend about 3 or 4 weeks working on that assignment. The second project will be at the end. We'll be giving you the specification a bit earlier. And that assignment will be a web app that you'll be building and deploying. Okay, that's our plan, really. So your calendar there. As I said, I'm keeping an eye on Slack here in case anybody wishes to give me a shout or has any comments to make. And I will try my best to answer those during the class if that's what you like, or during the break if the question is a bit more involved or I need to focus on it a little bit more. Just mention one thing then that we'll be interleaving in the first 6 weeks, which will be Introduction to UX Principles. My colleague Annette Stack, who you met briefly at the induction, will be guiding you through this field. It's a little bit orthogonal to the technical work of building a HTML page, but it's a very important aspect, which is the aesthetic look and feel of pages. And this is Annetta's specialization. And we will be looking for some aspects of UX best practice to be demonstrated in both projects, the first one and the second one. We'll be giving you more details of that as we proceed. Okay, that's the overview of the course itself. Let's look then now at what we're going to do exactly today, in today's session. So as I said, going to look first at the nature of the web. Just some general terminology and orient ourselves around the basic technology that we're going to be getting to grips with in the next period. So the nature of the web. Kind of 4 things I'd like to look at. One is what code means, particularly the importance of code in this course and in this entire program. There are many ways of building web applications, some of which do not require any code. You can find this type of product on the web fairly easily. But that's not what we're about. We're about building up websites at the lowest level using code itself. I'd like to talk about the internet in general for a few moments. We'll also talk about the web, which is on top of the internet, although we tend to blur the two lines. And we'll conclude this short session with some resources you might find useful. First of all, what do you mean by code? Well, we're working in text. We're not drawing web pages using tools. We're actually writing at the lowest level possible the code required for a page to be rendered successfully by a browser. There are two specific languages we're dealing with in this part of the course. HTML, that is Hypertext Markup Language, which is the core mechanism for specifying the content. And the second language we'll be encountering is CSS, Cascading Style Sheets. We'll be encountering that next week. And in fact, CSS is probably the more complex of the two. We'll find that HTML is reasonably straightforward, and we'll be getting to grips with it today. The labs we'll be building in the next few weeks will be incremental. So each lab will build on a previous lab. Sometimes we'll restart new ones, but there will be some continuity. So when you get finished with the lab, keep the work because you might need it again the following week. When we get to the following week, we'll have the solution anyway, or the completed version, which you can work from, or you can keep working with your own project as you evolve it. Definition of code. Well, it's just text, really. Here is one of the pages you'll be building in today's lab. Looks a bit indecipherable here. It seems just like a mess, really. And it's a valid page. It will be displayed correctly if we can persuade a browser to load it. I'm looking at it here in Notepad on Windows. But the browser doesn't care. Particularly doesn't care about how the page is laid out in its source form. And this is source here. And what we'll be doing today is we'll be looking very carefully at the page, more considered structure as shown here. In this version, we've got indentation. That is, we've got all of the elements nicely aligned. The editor we're using, if you look at it, has got color coding around the tags, the items in angle brackets, and some of the attributes, and the text itself. And there's various other hints and cues as we look at the page here, including line numbers, and including these dots here, whose significance we might uncover later on. So this is our world, really, the world of code, the world of handcrafting a web page. Talk about the internet for a few moments. I guess part of our lives now. We don't really think of it as anything exotic anymore. We would, I guess, visualize it in the old days as old-fashioned PCs connected to something. The something isn't one thing, it's a cloud. It's a vast network of computers. The image I'm showing you here, in fact, is a visual representation of what the internet looked like once. There's various crawlers that try to visit all pages and show their relationships. It's vast in dimensions, as we know. Is that right? 4 billion users in the world. My God, that's gone up 1 billion since the last time I looked at this page. This particular site here, if you go to it, will show you these actual numbers clicking up at a fairly alarming rate. The underlying nature of the web is built around what we call protocols and standards. That is, all of these millions of computers implement a range of protocols and standards to allow them to interoperate. Those protocols and standards, I guess, are the foundation of much of our working lives now. And the engineers that assemble and maintain these standards understand them at different layers or levels. 4-layer level is often a common way of looking at it. The link layer, network layer, transport layer, application layer. This won't really mean too much to us for the moment. But each of these layers, and they go from high to low, there are specific ranges of standards and protocols. Ethernet you might have heard of, very obscure network protocols, IGMP, ARP, etc. Transport layer protocols, TCP or TCP/IP is the most common one we use. And then at the highest level we have application layers. This is where the software lives. This is where you live. And this is where some small fragment of the standards and protocols in use here we will be getting familiar with in detail. In particular, we are very much interested in this one here, which is HTTP. It's got an accompanying standard, HTML, which we will be looking at today. Okay, that's the internet. What's the web? Well, the web is one of the application layer protocols. It's up at the highest level. Sometimes we call it the World Wide Web. It is operating over the internet, but separate from it. And it's primarily driven by a specific application type called the browser. And this is something we all use now in our daily lives. Use a browser on your desktop, browser on your phone. There are even mini versions of browsers going into devices. So it's a fairly widespread technology. This browser postdates the internet, and we can trace the exact year, month, and day on which the browsers appeared. And which browser you're using used to be a really big deal. The modern era browsers, which one you're selected is less important. We've been using Chrome, you might have looked at in our labs last week, but it really doesn't matter which one you use, as long as it's reasonably modern. When did they kick off? Well, early browsers like Mosaic, Netscape, Opera, and Internet Explorer all arrived on the scene in the early 90s. These implemented the HTML standard and the HTTP protocol. They were both focused on that set of technologies to implement. They were rivals to a certain extent, and they proceeded in a kind of a race with each other to implement new innovations in those protocols and standards. That is, they implemented HTML and CSS, but also a range of other technologies, including things like Java, which you're exploring with Column, XML, technologies such as Ajax you'll be learning about later on in the course, and also other browsers joined in the race in later years, Safari and Firefox in particular in the noughties. And towards the end of the first decade into the second decade of the 20th century, the pace quickened dramatically. Chrome arrived around 2008. And you can see in the diagram here, this isn't even up to date, the range of new capabilities these browsers had accelerated. What also accelerated, you can see here, is the rate at which the browsers were released. The numbers here are different version numbers. And the text here is the various technologies that these browsers implemented. 2D, 3D, drag and drop, offline applications, various extensions of CSS, the style sheet language we'll be looking at next week, and multimedia and FIA capabilities. Some of these capabilities were dead ends. Some are still in development, and some are ongoing and become part of how we use the web on a daily basis. The browsers themselves, I mentioned their versions. Well, in the early days of the web, which version of which browser you were using was important. Was I using IE, that's Internet Explorer 3 or 4? Could I shift to using a Safari 1? How did that compare with Firefox 2 and so on? And users of the internet in that world, and certainly developers, were very focused on those version numbers because things didn't always work correctly. And each new version number usually improved things, but they often broke things as well. So it was a kind of an unstable time for many years. Nowadays, if you ask somebody what version of Chrome we're using, they couldn't answer you. Indeed, I couldn't answer you. Chrome is being updated almost weekly directly into your workstation. And the same is the case with Firefox, and to a lesser extent with Safari. So we regard these browsers as what we call evergreen. They're always kept updated. They're also dramatically more stable and more consistent than in previous years. Some other things about the web. You may have heard of the term Web 2.0. Well, it's kind of old-fashioned now. People talk about 3 and Web 4.0 and so on, but the term has kind of gone a bit out of use. But going from what we thought of as Web 1 to Web 2 was a big threshold. It happened in the early noughties, perhaps towards the end of the first decade. And the big shift was the web became much more interactive media. It wasn't just consuming content, it was producing content. And obviously, the monster driver of content production is the social media world. Initially just blogs, but now, of course, the whole world of Facebook and related. The other big trend in this era, and this occurred a little bit later, the inflection point occurred in 2014, was mobile versus desktop. Previously, desktop was the only client type on the web. Mobile grew dramatically, particularly after the arrival of the iPhone. And then, of course, mobile is now the dominant and main platform on which the web is served. That was a painful transition at the time, largely because the small screen size means all of the web pages designed prior to that threshold crossover, sometimes called the inversion, were designed for larger screens, and getting down to the smaller screen became a challenge. That drive was called the move to responsive web sites and web applications. Responsive means responding to the dimensions of this smaller screen and being able to work realistically in that. I guess that threshold is passed now, and you can browse reasonably happily to most sites on the web, but that took engineering effort. It took the browsers to work a bit harder, and it was part of the adaptation process in that era. Another thing that's kind of slipped from view is web browser wars. Again, we used to look at what were the percentages for each of these browsers over the years. Lots of fear and uncertainty as one browser dominated and threatened to wipe all the others out. And then, of course, sometimes things happened and that browser faded and was replaced. The big one in the early years was the dominance of IE, which for a time threatened to strangle innovation. People got very worried about it. But then they didn't get worried about it for another period, and after a while it faded away and Chrome arrived. Currently there is a little bit of uneasiness around the dominance of Chrome vis-a-vis the other browsers, and also as in the choice of technologies these browsers use to render the web pages, but we'll talk about that in the future classes. One more point then on this, it's not just phones and desktop or laptop computers anymore, it's things. The Internet of Things revolution is well underway, and web-like interfaces are visible on some of these devices. Back to the web again, and this notion of protocols and standards. Just like to draw your attention to then just the ones we are interested in. which would be a protocol, which is HTTP. The nature of what a protocol is and the importance of HTTP isn't relevant for us immediately. We will be looking at that in about 4 or 5 weeks. For the moment, we are most interested in the standard HTML and CSS. These are international standards for specifying the structure and style of a web page. They're languages to a certain extent, but not programming languages really, not in the sense that Java is. We think of them as more like notations, a notation that we're going to be acquiring pretty soon. 2 terms I want to get comfortable with: client and server. These predate the internet. They're old computing terms. In fact, the term client-server computing was a paradigm back in the 80s and even in the 90s. We still use that phrase though in web development because the browser and the websites that the browser interacts with are client-server in their nature. And we talk about a client program and a server program. The client, in our case, being the browser, and the server being a web server or a host or a location where the web page we're interested in lives. And there's a kind of a distinct role between these two. Server's job is to manage and host all the pages, let's call it that. Pages including media and images and sound and other file types. The browser's job is just to ask the server, give me this page, 1 page at a time, usually. We won't really see the role of the server that clearly for a while yet, at least not until we deploy our websites, which we'll be doing in a few weeks. So for us, the first few labs, the server is just our computer. It's kind of invisible. The browser, of course, is our client. Role of the client. Well, this is running on your PC, and its job is to ask for web pages. We do that by putting in the address of the web page in the bar, or more typically by pressing on a link on a page, which is taking us to a new page. It's asking for that new page from somewhere, from the server, and that new page then is delivered to the browser, and then the browser's job is to display that page on the canvas. We sometimes talk about rendering the page. In fact, that term render will come back to us when we get into programming web apps later on. HTML tags then. We saw those very briefly last week. This is the language of us specifying the structure of a web page, laying out its contents, tagging it, you could even say. And these are the kind of tags you'll be experimenting with today: HTML, head, body, H1, H2, image, and also a style one in there, which we won't explain very well, but we'll at least see it. These tags are the way in which we specify the structure of a page. They're not visible to consumers of the page, obviously. They don't really make any sense to a user or a browser of our website, but they are what we are using to compose the web page itself. For example, I took a screenshot here of an old page. You can see it's got a color, it's got a box in there, title, header, seems to be movies. I've just put letters there around some interesting parts of this. Behind the scenes, the programmer who produced this page was working here with this view. That is laying out these tags, specifying some styles you can see there, and then specifying the actual content. So all the content was assembled, and of course the browser is rendering it in a way that's suitable for the consumer. So we're working over here in this world using the programmer's editor. We're composing various parts of that page. We're surrounding different elements with tags. And those tags, you can see the kind of structure of them here. They seem to open and close and include things. Notice also something we didn't see last week. This looks like ways of specifying not content, but presentation. Colors, margins, borders, fonts, etc. It's another language, in fact, embedded in the HTML language in this case. What I've just highlighted here in that box is an example of some simple CSS, cascading style sheet or style sheet. Okay, this language then, the HTML part, well, it's just a set of names really. The names each of these elements have, we call them elements, is reasonably readable and tends to make sense in terms of what the element is expected to do. H1, H2, body, P for paragraph. There are quite a number of them. It's not a case that we'd be going through these methodically one by one and learning them off and trying them out top to bottom, left to right. Last estimate, there's maybe 110 or so, 120, depending on how you count them, of these elements. Many of these we'll never use. Many of those elements, in fact, you would be encouraged to not use because they represent probably dead ends in the evolution of HTML. They still hang around though because of this legacy issue. Sites may have been built with some of these elements which should continue to run. Therefore, the elements will live on and be supported in varying degrees. So some of these elements, it's a bit like junk DNA in molecular science. They're just accumulated and kind of abandoned. How many do we need to know? Well, it's surprisingly a small number. I'd say 20 would be perfectly fine. And we'll be encountering most of what we need in the first few weeks. There's a couple of fun ways of grouping the elements. If you did want to get to know them in a bit more detail, you might visit or come across little charts like this, which try to draw HTML in the context of the periodic table of real elements. And you can see some of the categories there are interesting. Text, media, tables, forms. They kind of make sense, I think, in general. There's also some more exotic ones: web components, interactive, metadata, script. Well, some of these you will be encountering at a later stage, and there's a bit of activity going on in the whole world of web components in recent years, and this is quite a hot area, but it's not going to be something we'll be seeing in this course. Okay, I'll just finish up then this part and I'll give you a little break and might do a little quiz before we go on to the meat of our talks today, with a few references to interesting resources. I kind of like the MDN resources. This is the Mozilla Development Network. And we looked at a slide there some time ago. There was a browser called Mosaic and Mozilla that appeared very early in the evolution of the web, and this is the descendant of that movement. I think I linked these in the lab from last week, and they're also linked in this week's lab. Very good way of starting to learn about HTML. There's no ads on this site, so that's why I tend to steer clear of some of the other ones you might have stumbled upon, particularly W3C schools. That's fine, I guess, but we have enough ads in our lives, really. So this is an ad-free site, and it's open source and community driven. Well worth having a read through some of this. Not any great rush, but just as some background information. Particularly its introduction to CSS is very good, I think. And then it goes in quite depth here, beyond what we'll be doing. So it's a good place to start. This book, it's a bit dated now because I haven't updated it in a few years, but I just mentioned it briefly. I've taken some screenshots of this book in the slides here. It's from O'Reilly, publisher is very well known in computing industry. It's a famous publisher, in fact. And this is from a suite of books called the Head First books. And they're quite different from any other technical books you might have stumbled upon. They're different because it's not linear text. It's just pictures and handwritten drawings and all sorts of other bits and pieces in here. It tries to be a visual or left brain way of encountering technology in general, programming in particular, and they've also done a range of different books on web development. Some people like this style, some people hate it. So you could be either. I think it's quite novel, and there's a range of different titles in there that you might be interested in having a look at. Head First Programming there, for instance, or Head First Java is also there. You might find that fun. Okay, that's good. So just some basics then to get us off the ground. Nature of the web itself, I've been looking at. I'd like you to remember the terms client and server. These are important. And the role of the client and server in what we are dealing with. The client, as far as we're concerned, is our browser. Client's job is to display web pages. The pages are held on the server, and the client requests those pages as a response to maybe clicking links or entering values directly into the URL. Those clients and servers then understand the HTTP protocol. The client, if you like, converses with the server using this protocol. And the protocol will deliver HTML pages. That is, pages that are formulated against this international standard, which the browser understands and will effectively paint or render on the screen faithfully, hopefully, the intention of the programmer. Okay, I'll take a short break now. I'll take 10 minutes. I'll put up another quiz just for the fun of it. And when we return, we will look at the quiz and we'll then dive more deeper into HTML itself. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Okay, hi, thanks for doing that quiz there. We've got about 14 or 15 people online, which is great. Just going to review that quiz very briefly like we did earlier, and then we'll get into the core of what we're doing today. So, quiz. The context of the web browser is a program that runs where? On the client, on the server, both, and neither. I guess, yes, we're looking about it running on the client, really. Although somebody put in running on both, not 100% wrong. There are bits of the browser that have been broken off and that now run on some servers. That's the technology we'll be looking at next year, in fact. Some web applications are using JavaScript, which is a client technology originally, is now also a server technology. So not quite fully 100% accurate. Which of the following is not a web browser? Chrome, Firefox, WebKit, Safari. Everybody got Chrome, which is WebKit, which is the correct answer. However, WebKit is a significant web technology. It's in browsers. In fact, it's the rendering engine in Chrome and Safari. So it's not a browser in its own right. It's an important piece of a browser, and often developers, when they're looking at different browsers, or if ever a new one arrives, that's not that often now, one of the first things we ask is what is the rendering engine? And if the answer is WebKit, then we're reasonably comfortable because we've seen that before. But then occasionally new web rendering engines arrive. Firefox's rendering engine is called Gecko, and Microsoft have their own. Third question here was which of these standards defines the structure and content of a page? The correct answer is HTML. So we talk about structure and content, HTML, style and presentation, we'd say CSS. The protocol the browser uses to fetch pages, we would say is HTTP. And what's XML? Well, XML and HTML are closely related. If you like, you could think of XML as being a superset of HTML, or being the parent of HTML to a certain extent. XML is a markup language in general. HTML is a specific variant of XML for web presentation only. And finally, how many tags are there in total? 110, I think I might have said. I'm not even certain if I'm right in that. So somebody who said 250 mightn't be too far off it. Particularly if we looked at tags that were ever retired or experimental ones. But in general, about 100 is a reasonable answer, I think. Yes. Again, 20 is fine for us, maybe 30. I don't think you'd be using more than 30 though, ever. Right, let's get in then to HTML basics, which is the focus really for what you'll be doing in the labs. And I'll also look at the labs again before we finish up today. So this is our last session. The next break will be terminating. Just remind you, when I finish up today, I'll ask you to do an exit quiz, a bit like the same one that Colm did with you on Monday and Wednesday. Okay, some of the things we need to know now to do the lab and to maybe take forward into next week will be understanding what a HTML element is, and particularly variants of it. An important aspect in the next few weeks will be paths, particularly relative and absolute paths. We're not doing too many experiments on this today, but it will become a bit of a pain point in next week's lab. So we'll just introduce it today and revisit it next week. The notion of nesting is important. That is elements inside elements, and how we can easily get that wrong. And if we get that wrong, that has some implications. And finally, block and inline elements. Various ways of categorizing the elements we need to learn. One of those categories is the element a block or an inline? And we'll be able to answer that question today, hopefully. So we'll start with elements, attributes, and documents. Particularly elements, attributes, which we're going to talk about right now. So this is a complete element taken from a screenshot from one of those Head First books I mentioned earlier. You can see the basic idea: a tag in angle brackets, some content, and then the tag again repeated, but the closing tag has got a forward slash leading it. So we see an forward slash in here, which means it's terminating the tag that presumably opened here. So these two symbols bound the element, and then the content is inside those elements. So we talk about the element name, content, and the element name again with a forward slash. So that's an example here of the title element. The word title is a valid HTML tag name. It expects standard string content inside it, and it expects to be closed. Here's another one, P. This is the paragraph element. We looked at that last week. It's standard text in what you would think of as a paragraph. So the element name is P, the closing element is /P, and the content is just ordinary text relevant to the page we're building. Here's another one, A. This is the anchor tag. This is what drives the internet. This is the tag that changed the world, I guess. Any link you click on a web page is almost always going to be an A tag implemented by some programmer. Look at the content or the structure though of the tag. It's a little bit different from the earlier simple ones we looked at. We have the opening of the tag, the closing of the opening tag, and then we have the closing tag here. And inside the opening tag we have what we call an attribute. This is this thing here. This is very significant because what we're saying here is this is going to be displayed on the page. It's going to be text, maybe like a paragraph, App Store, but it will be a link. It'll be an anchor link to some other page. And that other page is specified by the href attribute. Might think of that as a shortcut for hypertext reference, href. So you'll be doing one of these today and maybe inventing a few more yourselves as you go along. Hypertext reference, the A tag. But notice the slightly different structure from what we had previously. Another example then of href. Again, I've drawn this from the text. I'm going to look at one interesting thing here. Here is the A tag, the link called Great Movies. And down here is the same tag. And you notice a slight difference here. We didn't put in double quotes. Now, if you write a page like this and you forget the double quotes, nothing happens. What I mean by that is it works exactly as before. And this is the case for many of the tags and structures even you will be building on HTML. HTML is a highly permissive language. In fact, in last week's lab, there was one or two mistakes and it made no difference. Some of you spotted it, but didn't change the way the page was rendered. That's kind of your friend in one sense, in that it's permissive and it doesn't get too fussy about typos you might make. It's also your enemy in other circumstances because you may develop practices that are not good longer term and that could cause difficulty later on, particularly as we make the pages become part of applications. So we're trying to avoid bad practice if at all possible. And we're relying often on our programmer's editor to tell us about these rather than on the browser itself, which autocorrects them, tries to figure out what you were trying to do, suppresses possibly illegal or nonsensical elements and just plows on. So bear that in mind. This is dramatically different from what you're doing in programming, where any error is punished immediately. Not by column, obviously, but by the Java compiler. Here's another example, image. We've got a img tag. Again, one of the primary foundational tags of the web. It's going to display a picture inside a web page. Absolutely bedrock of any interesting page is going to be its imagery. It's a bit like the href attribute we had in the previous one, except we have src for source. And this is where things get a little bit tricky. Initially, you're going to be dealing with paths here. So we're specifying a path to the image. And that path isn't just the name of the image on its own. It's a bit more going on there. We've somehow got funny notations, dot, dot, and forward slashes and all this thing. This is going to be annoying to you for the first few weeks, but then you'll just get comfortable with it. We're always going to be having to, looking at our projects, understand what folders or subfolders we're using in the project and how to reach into one subfolder from another. Dot dot has a very significant meaning. It means go up one level from whatever resource you are currently using. Okay, here is some other elements then, and you can see doc type here in action. You can see HTML, you can see head, and you can see body. So we see all of these elements here. They are all HTML elements that have a specific role in the structure of a page. I'm not going to treat all of them in great detail for the moment. They're reasonably sensible. An entire page is enclosed within HTML. So you know that the HTML tag starts here and closes here. And then it consists of the head section and the body section. So it's quite a logical tree structure if you think of it like that. And we'll be coming back to that notion of a tree a little bit later on. Okay, linking. We've already seen a little bit of this, and this is something we'll need to get to grips with. Particularly, I think it requires you to experiment with it in the labs as opposed to spending too much time looking at it here. In the projects you'll be building in web, we're not going to put all of our files into one folder. We're going to be dividing up the project into multiple folders, and the files will be inside those folders. That is, we'll be nesting the content in some structured, ordered manner. In the lab, you might have an images folder, and then you might have a number of other folders in which you'll have some content. So these then mean that if we're constructing links between pages, that is, if I would like to make an index page contain a link to another page, or vice versa, then I'm going to be building an appropriate element containing the path from the page where I'm placing the element into or out to the target. So for instance, in today's lab, you'll be seeing links from the index to one of the image files so it can be loaded. Now, if you get that wrong, and if you don't get the correct formulation of the link, you get errors, 404 errors. You've probably seen that number arise. 404 is terminology from HTTP, from the Hypertext Transfer Protocol standard. 404 means couldn't find that page, link didn't work. Or you might get nothing, you might just get a blank. Now, links come in two forms, absolute and relative. And we're going to have to get to grips with these in the next period. Absolute links are reasonably straightforward to understand because they specify complete path, usually going back to the disk drive that the asset is held on, all the way through all the subfolders until we get to the actual artifact. It could be an image or it could be a HTML file. So C:/web development /labo1/image/Xbox JPG is a complete absolute path to that resource. Here though, we've got relative paths. Here is a link to the same file, but it doesn't contain the C web development /lab. It just says ./images. So the second one is relative, and it is relative to wherever your starting point is, which presumably might be inside Lab 01. So this one here with dot means current folder, go forward into images. Dot dot, slightly more subtle. It means wherever you currently are, go up one, then go down into, or stay horizontal with, the folder you find yourself in. In this case here, we're staying in apps.html. Now, I won't get too bogged down on this, and we won't actually be worried too much about it for this week's lab, but you might want to come back to this slide next week, and we may have another example just to get you eased into it next week. So some examples of what you will see then. Here is a couple of links. Two of them are correct. The third one is not correct, but it probably will work. This is part of the challenge when we're working with web development, this permissive nature of the browser itself. So the first one contains a link to apps.html, a link to a specific file. So when we put that into a page, it assumes that that file exists in the same directory as the page in which we're putting in that element. So if I put that element there inside, I'll just clear that for a moment, sorry. If I put that element there inside index, then it's going to successfully link to apps because they're both in the same folder. The second example is a relative path with using dot and using a folder name. This one is a little bit more complicated, but it's reasonably straightforward when you get around to it. It means that wherever you are, find the images folder, and the file I want to reference is in that folder, and it's called banner in this instance. So if I insert that element into apps, then it will successfully locate banner, and this will be loaded directly into the page correctly. Now this last one is very bad, and we want to try and avoid this at all costs. This is an example of an absolute path tied to a specific folder on your computer. We want to never see, really, if possible, drive letters like this, and absolute paths, would be very careful about using them. They will be relevant in about 4 weeks' time, but the technology we have for the moment, they're banned, really, because they won't work properly. So we try not to use absolute paths, always use relative paths if possible for the moment. But bear in mind, sometimes the absolute paths work, but they only work on your computer. And if you were to take that website elsewhere, those links will fail. So we need to be a little bit careful about how we consider those. Okay, we'll come back to that again next week. I'd like to move on then with two more things before we finish today. Nesting and then line breaks. Start with nesting. You've seen nesting in action already. HTML is the parent element of all elements on our page. Body is nested within that. Paragraphs may be nested within body. Other elements may in turn be nested within paragraph, like Q for quotation. So it's a bit like a Russian doll thing, one inside the other. And we visualize the entire structure, not so much as a nested container, but as a tree. Particularly, I think the technical term would be an acyclic graph. But think of it as a tree. HTML is the root, and we're branching out until we keep branching until we eventually get to leaves on the tree. In fact, that tree is very significant. It's part of how the browser processes the page. It does actually build a tree in memory. The tree is called the DOM, or Document Object Model. And you as a programmer can access that tree. You can access it by writing programs inside your web pages in JavaScript. Now we won't be doing that. It's a topic for a future course, not even in this one. but the tree must be constructed by the browser. And if the page is incorrectly formed, then the process of building the tree will fail or become inconsistent. So that means we've got to be careful to get the nesting right. And there's bad nesting and there's good nesting. And it's very logical, really. So all we have to do really is bear in mind that when you open an element and then you open another element inside this, you must close them in reverse order. And you can see that's not happening in the bad example here. In the second example, we're opening P, then we are opening EM. EM is an emphasis, our italics tag. And then we're closing P, but EM is still open. And then EM arrives to close things off, and well, we just don't know what to do with that. We certainly can't build an accurate tree at this point of the content, so it's a fail really at this point. Now, as I said, the browser will probably be reading this, figure it out, and probably transpose it in the browser in the DOM it builds, so you may notice no difference. But if these kind of errors built up, then you might get inconsistencies longer term, and the page would be considered to be badly formed or not correctly formed. Okay, let's look at our final topic then for today. And then I'll let you go. Line break, block, and inline elements. One of the things you might notice in any pages you experiment with in HTML is you put in line breaks. That is, you put in text on multiple lines. Maybe you're creating a paragraph and you're doing some experimentation. Bring it up in the browser, and all of the line breaks you thought were there are gone. That is, the browser seems to do some processing on your page, removing line breaks, and you might like to experiment with that later on. Now, that's just something we need to get to grips with fairly early, really. The line break idea ultimately comes from typesetting and the way typewriters deal with line breaks. You know, you push this lever and restart a new line. That's a hard break. We think of it in terms of character codes. But unless you put in a hard break, you have a soft break, and they're filtered out or ignored by the browser. So if you do want a new line, it doesn't happen just by you entering a new line in the editor. You must force the new line to take place via a specific element or tag. And these are called BRs, breaks. And you can see them in action here. You can also see some other elements you haven't seen yet. Block quote, you might like to experiment with that. And then we can see the BR element ending each line. If you do not include the BR element here, that is, if you don't put these in, then the text here will all be on one line, probably. So BR forces the breaks to take place. So that's how it looks on the page if we're just extracting it, and we can see we've got line breaks forced in there by putting the BR element. Now, this BR element is kind of funny. We've got 3 different variants of it. First one, I have open and close. Okay, so BR opens, BR close. It's one single hard break. It is possible for me to write that by just forgetting the close break. It's also possible for me to write it by indicating a space and then a slash inside the angle bracket. All of these 3 are considered correct. And you might see a possible problem then that arises here. This one in particular, surely I'm opening a tag here, I'm not closing it, and if I open another tag, isn't the tree going to be formed incorrectly, or is there some nesting problem going to happen because I never closed the tag? Well, the answer to that is yes, there is. The correct way of doing it is to close it formally, or close it inline. But HTML says, don't worry about it. This is a singular element. The element doesn't need to be closed, and it's perfectly fine to do this. Now, there was a time when, in the standards evolution, the information scientists building HTML were worried about this and were insisting on rules that would enforce an error if you opened a tag without closing it and so on. Well, HTML5, which is the standard we're currently using, is quite liberal about these kind of things. And we just say BR is a special element, doesn't need to be closed. End of story. And don't worry too much about the possible inconsistencies because the browser understands this is a special element. There are a few others like this. Not many, but a few. One of them being image, which also does not need to be closed. Okay, one last topic then, and then we'll finish up. Block versus inline. So when you get a new element, you may want to, of the 20 elements we're going to learn, ascertain fairly quickly which ones are inline and which ones are block, because it makes a difference in the default layout. You can change that behavior. Specifically in CSS, we can change it. We haven't discussed that yet. But there is a default behavior which is useful to be on top of from an early stage. H1 is a block. H2, so is P, so is block quote. So you put a H1 in there, and then you follow it with a paragraph. There will be a hard break between the H1 and the paragraph. That's enforced by the default behavior. If you put a paragraph on it, and inside the paragraph you embed either a quote or an A tag, that is the link tag, you'll be doing that today, then it's inline. There isn't a new blank line put around those elements. It's a little bit hard to talk about in the abstract, but perhaps you'll encounter it fairly quickly when we get up and running in the lab this afternoon. A link inside a web page will be inline a paragraph. Headers, though, will be block, and they'll be going on to new lines. We won't need to put BRs around those. Okay, so that's what we were trying to do today then. I think we've got the basics now of what an element is. Perhaps not so much relative and absolute paths yet, but that's an important topic for next week, although we've seen at least the outline of what they are. Nesting, I think you've seen, and we have it in practice. All elements must open and close in the right order. But of course, that's complicated by some elements will open and never close because they're implicitly closed. BR being one of those, a break. And finally, block and inline. The few elements we've come across now are one or the other usually. And well, we can just check that visually by opening the page in the browser and seeing whether it's block or inline, there's a break or not between the two. So I'd like you to get into the labs then, if you could today. There's one lab today, 5 steps. I'll just point out one of the steps here is a bit of a wild card in that it is bringing you into a realm that we haven't looked at yet, and that is step 5, which has you exploring a little bit of CSS, and that's the topic really of next week. Otherwise, the labs are reasonably straightforward. I don't think you'll have any problem with the HTML. What you may struggle with a little bit is files, folders. Using Sublime, I'm asking you to download images and store them inside your project. Now, we're giving you plenty of screenshots along the way to see exactly what's happening, so try your best to get through that. It's starting to fall apart. You can contact us on Slack, and we can see if we can try and dig you out of it. But spend some time just wrestling with it anyway initially to see how far you get. There are some exercises at the end of the lab today, 5 in fact. I'm not expecting you to do all these. You're not going to be submitting these either, so they're short enough really. They're just for you to explore. They're not part of your assignment or your test in any sense. They're just ways of getting to grips with some of the topics we've encountered today. The first exercise is useful to try and get your head around, which is downloading an archive, unzipping it and opening it. Again, if you're not used to doing this kind of stuff, it will be a little bit alien initially. But archives of solutions, that zipped versions or compressed versions of work we do, will be a feature of this course, and sooner or later you're going to try and just get to grips with it. That's it then. So as you perhaps seen, the lab is these steps. It's the same style that Colm is using. You go to the first step. You don't go on to the next step till you've completed the first one. You're more or less working top to bottom inside the step. It is important that you keep an eye on the screenshots and try and replicate in your machines what I'm doing. I'm showing you Windows here largely. Mac, I think you're going to have to figure out, but it's fairly equivalent. Wherever I'm asking you to put in code, that is HTML, bear in mind that it doesn't happen in step 4. You can just copy and paste the code. You don't have to type this in manually. I guess there is a point at which you might like to type in the code to get used to it, but I probably wouldn't recommend it for this lab at least, because this is just stock content. It's not of any great help to us. So just right clicking and copy here, paste into wherever you're going. Again, I mentioned step 5 introduces something different. That is a completely different language, which is not HTML here. And we're not really even introducing that. So try it out. If it doesn't make any sense, we'll be dealing with it all next week. In fact, HTML is the easiest part. CSS, as I might have mentioned last week, is the big challenge really. You could be learning CSS for a year and you still wouldn't get to the bottom of it. If you were learning HTML for a year, you'd be very bored after a month. So we'll be covering just as much CSS as we need to be able to press on and do interesting things with it. Okay, that's great. I'll ask you to do the exit quiz. The exit ticket, as it's called, just asks you for a little bit of feedback, and then it's in 3 questions, I think, if I remember correctly. The third question is to answer a question that I'm going to pose to you. And the question I'm going to ask you now is, which of the topics we've encountered today was the most challenging? So which topic was the most challenging today? If you have time, it's fine. If you don't, it doesn't really matter. Okay, I'll be signing off now. I'm just kicking off the exit ticket now. And it's in the same place as previous. So good luck with the labs. Might see you on Slack. If not, I will see you all next week. Okay, cheerio.